I think the income angle is still a challenge. Second, with respect to youth unemployment, there both official and private sector data, although they may vary in terms of the percentages, that still remains an important issue. And it is not so much a question of only involuntary unemployment, much of it is voluntary unemployment. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm very happy to be back here to talk to you at the BFSI Summit on the economy and also specifically with respect to the financial sector. I would like to share a few thoughts. As AKB said, post-afternoon sessions are quite challenging, and I hope either you feel refreshed intellectually or you feel refreshed physically after a nap once I finish speaking. Either way, I hope it turns out to be a good session for you. Couple of months ago, we were faced with the penal tariff from the US, and we looked at a 50% tariff rate, and a lot of us were wondering whether economic growth rate in the current financial year would sort of tend towards the 6% range. That was a concern at that time. Now, fast forward 2 months later, now people are wondering whether it will be 7% or above, and we ourselves did not revise our growth forecast. By nature, we are somewhat on the cautious side. We had given a range of 6.3 to 6.8% as the real GDP growth rate for 25-26. And we said, after seeing the data for the first quarter, and also at that time when we presented the first quarter GDP numbers, looking at the 2 months of second quarter data at the time which we had by August, we said second quarter was also looking to be on track to be a 7% GDP growth number. So together, we feel that this financial year, we will be somewhere to the north of our range of 6.3 to 6.8, even above 6.8% for the full financial year is concerned. I will not be surprised if there is a 7 handle in front of the decimal place for the full financial year. And that is what we even mentioned in the monthly economic review which we put out by the Department of Economic Affairs. So this is a very happy state of affairs considering the uncertainties we were staring at in late August. Now, few things have helped. One is, of course, as time passes, we tend to forget that the budget of 25-26 did present a very important, significant direct tax relief to the extent that a family of 2 earners earning 2.6 million rupees will pay 0 income tax for the financial year. I think that has now sort of gone out of the public consciousness because it's more than 8 months old. And then there was a direct tax simplification effort. And more recently, in September, there has been a considerable revision of the rates in GST, simplification, elimination of slabs, process simplification, etc., and all of which are beginning to pay off in terms of a boost to consumption. Now, most of us see this as a boost to consumption only, which is true as a first cut effort. But it is a boost to investment also, because most industrialists want demand visibility before they commit. Contrary to what we think, both international evidence and domestic evidence will tell us that interest rates matter, but only somewhat weakly compared to what demand does to capital formation. So, a boost to disposable income, to purchasing power in the form of a direct tax relief and a significant indirect tax relief, both of them are not just demand stimulus measures, and it is also fallacious to say that the government is shifting its focus from investment or supply side measures to demand side measures, because A, they are both 2 sides of the same coin, and 2, demand visibility is the biggest service that government could do through policy for private sector capital formation. And the other important thing we could do, and which we are doing for boosting capital formation, is to ensure that inflation rate and therefore both short-term and long-term interest rates are firmly kept on leash. Now, most of us would be looking at the CPI numbers lately and thinking that it has come down to such low levels of below 2%, largely because of cyclical factors like food price inflation, and that is true. However, we are not very good in understanding structural changes happening in real time. We all need the benefit of hindsight to be able to see it from a distance, both temporally and spatially. We need the distance to be able to figure it out. And the important thing that we are not according as much value as we should be is the last 10 years of investment in physical infrastructure and supply-side infrastructure, supplemented by the digital infrastructure which has happened especially post-COVID. Now, these two together remove a lot of bottlenecks that used to bedevil the economy, so much so that after 3 to 4 years of growth, we used to run into routine overheating signs and cycles, overvalued exchange rates, high inflation, high trade deficit, and current account deficit, etc. And then you get into a banking crisis cycle and the whole thing repeats, rinse, lather, and repeat kind of thing. Now, obviously, it is still early days to celebrate, but I believe that the improvement in physical goods handling in terms of port infrastructure, the amount of length of highways built, power capacity generation, and the fact that we have uninterrupted power for the most part in most of the country, and in terms of the number of airports and connectivity, etc., the formalization of the economy that DPI has facilitated, all of these things are also improving and relieving supply constraints, and in the economist jargon, they are contributing to an improvement in the potential growth rate, notwithstanding external uncertainties. And that is also an important dimension of why inflation is likely to be structurally low. And if I may stick my long neck out, I can say that in the coming years, we will see our inflation rates converge to that of the developed country rates. And therefore, one of the important economic variable which we are used to seeing depreciate every year at the rate of about 3% on average over the last 30 years, I don't think we should be expecting a similar pattern to prevail in the coming 5 to 10 years as well. In other words, I do see that the Indian economy, Indian rupee rather, becoming even stable to stronger in the coming years than the historical average depreciation pattern against the US dollar that we have seen on average in the last 30 years. The second biggest contribution, apart from demand stimulus that the government has made to the economy, both in terms of macro stability and in terms of lowering the cost of capital, is its adherence to the fiscal path, the glide path spelled out post-COVID. Now, this year, although numbers might say that it is a challenging situation because of low nominal GDP growth, the fact is the fiscal numbers are on track to achieve the 4.4% gross fiscal deficit ratio. And some of the commentary has said, well, going forward, the government has now given more of a visible path to debt rather than deficit ratio. That should be a concern only if India does not have an inflation policy. We do have an inflation policy. Central bank targets inflation. And therefore, the possibility, theoretical possibility, that you could achieve a reduction in the debt to GDP ratio while running a high inflation rate, so much so that even with deficit rising, you could see the debt ratio coming down because of high inflation. That is one such fear that is expressed. But that fear should be banished, because we have an inflation target, and inflation, as I mentioned, due to the various improvements happening in the economy, including in food production, hopefully notwithstanding climate vagaries, I think we don't think the idea is to inflate away the debt by giving you a debt to GDP timeline over the next 5 years and both debt and deficit ratios will maintain their steady, gradual declining path, which is the important policy stability that the government can offer to the private sector. And that is the reason why the 10-year borrowing cost of Government of India, which was 9.5% 10 years ago, is now at 6.5%. And that naturally means benchmark interest rate being lower, the private sector interest rates have also come down. And that is the biggest fiscal stimulus a government can give, which is to lower the cost of capital for everybody in the economy. So all told, notwithstanding the uncertainties temporarily that we are facing, the economy is doing as well as it can and better than what we feared a couple of months ago. And that's a good thing, because growth is obviously the most important necessary condition upon which fiscal revenues or welfare payments and many other parameters depend on. I now turn my attention in the next 10 minutes specifically to the theme of this conference, which is the banking, financial services, and so on. And before I turn to that theme, I do want to point out, however, notwithstanding the good news and the sunny picture we see amidst the clouds, the structural trends that we are going to witness in the next 25 years in the world, not India, I'm talking about the world, they are going to be materially different from what we got used to in the last 40 years. Greater integration, greater mobility of goods and services, and global as a world as a single market, just-in-time production models, those things have reached their peak. And this is par for the course in terms of long cycle. Those who have been studying cycles for centuries, you will realize that the heydays of globalization actually preceded First World War. So globalization was not a new phenomenon. It was there before the First World War. Then the First World War to Second World War, it largely disappeared. And then post-World War II, it came back very slowly. First, goods markets, and then slowly after the 80s, the financial markets or the capital markets integration happened. And now, as per historical cycles, the world will retreat. Instead of integration, there is going to be fragmentation. It is happening in the goods market, it will happen in the services market, it will happen even in the capital markets. This is how the world has evolved, through cycles, rather than one structural pattern prevailing right through, as we normally mistake it to be. It is not going to be the case. And therefore, in this situation, there will be a natural tendency to look for domestic strengths and domestic production being home-shored, on-shored, friend-shored, etc. But that will not be enough. We have to basically go from indigenization to strategic resilience or strategic invulnerability as a precondition to becoming strategically indispensable to the world. In other words, while we are very correctly focused on making sure that many of the important components are produced inside the country, it can happen only by being exposed to the world. And therefore, there is a difference between industrial policy, import substitution, based on import substitution, and there is a difference between that and what I call strategic invulnerability and strategic indispensability. India should be aiming towards strategic invulnerability in the coming years as a precondition to becoming a strategically indispensable nation. A country that has aspirations to be the world's second or third largest economy by 2050, in terms of the GDP size and so on, cannot simply withdraw inside its borders, and openness brings with it a certain leverage that we are currently missing in the global discourse. Given that imperative, that openness, resilience, indispensability are important parts of where we want to be aspirationally, what is it that the financial sector can and should be doing? Because remember, apart from the disruption that is happening in the world of goods markets through tariff, There is the phenomena of stable coins, US dollar stable coin, that is also going to be an important development in 2026. Fortunately, we in this country have done a fantastic job of fast payment systems and the UPI as well, creating a national seamless payment system, which is not there even in the European Union and in several other advanced countries. So to that extent, the need for a stable coin inside India is far less so than it is in, for example, in European Union. However, with respect to international transfers and payments, etc., the presence of a dollar stable coin will bring with it its own challenges for monetary policy, monetary transmission, and for seniorage benefits of any country. And more importantly, it will present a challenge to the intermediation that banks have been doing for decades and centuries. In this environment, what should banks be doing? So, apart from the challenge that other financial sectors or other financial markets pose to banks and their ability to attract deposits, stable coins will become one more source of competition for banks in terms of being able to act as intermediary and to be able to attract deposits. And therefore, banks have an obligation and a personal self-preservation interest to take digital arrest much more seriously than what they are doing so far. Digital arrest, where many elderly people are robbed of their hard-earned savings kept in bank accounts, banks have an obligation to treat those cases both urgently and sensitively. Without that, there will be a tendency for people to withdraw their bank deposits and adopt an inferior solution of keeping them under the mattress. Cash in circulation will go up, banks will lose their intermediation role, etc. Therefore, taking digital arrest very seriously by the banking community or the banking fraternity is very important, because it might over time undermine the very foundation of banking. The second element, which the union government and state governments are investing in very much in these years, is deregulation. As you might be aware, there are two informal groups of ministers working on deregulation. There is a task force looking at state-level deregulation, and there is a high-level committee under the former cabinet secretary on deregulation. It's very important that when we think of deregulation, we think of only the government as something that has to act in this area, whether it is union government or state governments or government regulatory bodies, etc. But frankly, the Indian private sector is no less of a laggard when it comes to imposing its own compliance requirements on the public. Forget about using the KYC of other institutions for oneself. Within the same financial institution, even if I have a relationship with one part of the institution, the other part of the institution still demands all the papers from me again, even though another division of the same financial institution has all the information from me. And once again, I'm asked to submit papers, certified, attested, etc., all over again. So when it comes to compliance and documentary requirements, we as a society have to change. It is not only the government that has to be the front runner in reducing documentary and compliance requirements. The Indian private sector is no slouch in this matter, and definitely not the Indian financial sector. And it is partly because we as a country are a low trust society. We have very high trust within small groups, kinships, and networks, but we have very low trust outside our familiar networks, kinship, and groups. There is a story about, which I mentioned in the Kautilya Economic Conclave in Delhi early this month, when a situation was given to people from different countries. You are in a car, you are a passenger, your friend is driving at 35 miles per hour. The speed limit in that area is 20 miles per hour. Your friend hits a pedestrian. What will you do? Your friend's lawyer says, if you testify that your friend was driving at 20 miles per hour, he will get off with a lighter punishment. Will you do it? Survey respondents from many developed Western countries said they will not lie for their friend, whereas survey respondents from Asian, African, Persian Gulf countries said they will lie for their friend and say that he was driving at 20 miles per hour. This is not a matter of shame or embarrassment, because after all, when asked, all of us will say, even in the West, friends and family come first. That is the kind of ethos we carry forward into public space as well. And once we do so, it has got a completely different dynamics. If you put friends and family first, your ability to scale up as an economy goes down, because there is less trust outside your friends and family and small kinship and networks. And therefore, this concept of putting friends and family first, which is very noble and ideal, has its own limitations when you apply it to the public policy context or scalability context for an economy of this size. And that is why I think trust has to develop, and institutions both in the public and the private sector have to be the ones to set an example. And the last point I would say is, banks are still reluctant to use digital tools despite the digital public infrastructure being a big success story of India. Whether it is account aggregator or cash flow based lending or using digital signs or digi-locker documents, etc., financial institutions are still insisting on paperwork, still insisting on collateral-based lending when the information flow is no longer as scarce as it was before. Formalization of the Indian economy has been one of the important success stories of the last 5 years. And therefore, I think it's very important that the financial institutions themselves understand the kind of global scenario we are going to face in the next 25 years. It is going to be very different from what it was in the last 40 years, and all of us have to pull our weight. If GDP size of India has to be commensurate with its strategic relevance in the world, every one of us have to think about what is it that we can do differently and better and unconventionally than what we were used to in the last 40 years. With that kind of mindset, then we will be able to overcome both near-term and long-term uncertainties. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nageshwaran, for this wonderful presentation. Dr. Nageshwaran was asking me that should he make a PowerPoint presentation or should he make a speech, and I had taken the liberty of advising him that no, he is a very good speaker and he should rather speak to our audience. And I think you have proved me right, Dr. Nageshwaran. If any one of you were trying to go off to sleep, I'm sure the idea of digital arrests, the absence of trust in telling your friend that no, he was not driving above the speed, and the reluctance of the banking sector not to go digital as well as it should are thoughts that I'm sure must have woken you up. With these words, let me just jump into a conversation with you, brief conversation. We have around 15 minutes time. What we will do is this, that, you gave a very detailed presentation on the India's growth story. I'm just trying to find out from you, how do you see the job scenario and how do you place the job challenge in that growth dynamics? I think your point are really well taken. India is in a sweet spot right now, but how do you see the job challenge? And I know that it is not the government responsibility only to create jobs, it is the economy's responsibility to create jobs. But is there anything that needs to be done? We need to move in a certain direction so that the demand side of the economy probably gets a better lift. Your thoughts?
Thank you, AKB. I think it's a question that one can sort of spend hours
Yeah, sure.
trying to come up with answers. So it's a big challenge to be very brief on your question. So currently, I think even with respect to job creation per se, based on both official data, whether it is PLFS or EPFO data, or what we see being put out by the private sector agencies, I think the job creation is currently doing well. It is the income growth that has to accompany the job creation.
Which is not
where-
coming through.
Sorry?
Which is not coming through, really. Yeah.
That is, I think, there is still room for improvement there. But some of it is cushioned by the fact that both states and the union governments have considerable fiscal transfers that is happening. And until very recently, you also had the wealth effect playing out. But of course, recently, the wealth effect to Indians coming from the appreciation of gold prices has been a major compensation to the loss of wealth effect coming from the stock market in the last 1 year.
That's right,
So the gold price increase, considering the estimates that are prevailing in the public domain about the amount of gold that Indians have, if you really calculate the wealth effect, it has been quite significant as well.
Right, yeah.
So I think the income angle is still a challenge. Second, with respect to youth unemployment, there both official and private sector data, although they may vary in terms of the percentages, that still remains an important issue. And it is not so much a question of only involuntary unemployment, much of it is voluntary unemployment, again, partly because of the fiscal transfers, and partly because of various logistics and cultural and language differences and diversity, etc. And therefore, some of the technical initiatives like what Nandan Nilekani's Ekstep Foundation is doing in several parts of the country, doing a pilot, what they call Blue Dot Revolution, which is to use GPS and AI to connect employers and young job seekers living in the same neighborhood within a 10 to 20 kilometer radius. Those kinds of initiatives will play a very important role. And of course, not to rule out the importance of watching what AI will do to the labor market. I think apart from education, skilling, and deregulation, which are all government responsibilities, it's equally important on the part of the private sector as well to make manufacturing an aspirational sector to work for. We have done that with respect to IT jobs in the last 30 years. Now, all of us collectively have to put our heads together and try to make manufacturing and jobs done with professional and vocational skills an aspirational job. I think that is the direction in which we have to go if we have to maintain the employment generation that is required for us to deliver on Viksit Bharat.
On the AI challenge, how much time do you think we have? Because it seems it is already impacting upon us.
It's a fair question, but it's a difficult question to answer. Because there are mixed evidence on whether AI is delivering on the potential it claims to be delivering, which in one way is not a bad thing if it is not, because then its ability to replace humans will also be limited if it is not delivering on its potential. But whether that justifies the valuations, etc., that's a different story. We don't have to get in there. But it will be a good thing in a way if the pace of improvement in AI moving into AGI is slow or even non-existent at one level. But in some sectors, definitely we should be able to leverage AI in education and healthcare, in reaching remote corners in remote populations, etc. But in some other areas, I think we have to be much more careful and be able to draw the line, or at least make sure that the productivity and profitability gains accruing from the application of AI are distributed fairly. So it is both a question of policy design and private sector consciousness. Both have to work together there.
Absolutely. You know, in your presentation, you talked about the fiscal policy review initiative that have been taken. Debt anchor concept is being introduced. And simultaneously, we are also seeing a monetary policy framework also being reviewed. There seems to be, there should be a jugalbandi between the two. How do you see the two reviews progressing? And would you have any thoughts of the kind of tweaks or changes you need to bring about in the monetary policy review framework in line with what we're doing in the fiscal policy framework, because that is now becoming debt anchored. So with lower debt, what does it mean for the monetary policy? So how do you see the two working together?
Yeah, I think the Jugalbandi is happening, is there.
Yeah.
Unlike in the Western world where now there are concerns about fiscal dominance emerging, there is
Yeah.
no such fear here because the union government is sticking to the fiscal prudence and fiscal stability path, and therefore it is a Jugalbandi. And in fact, even with respect to inflation targeting, apart from central bank actions, actually to a large extent, fiscal restraint has also contributed quite considerably to the delivery of overall declining inflation, even if seasonally we have had spurts of food price inflation, etc. So therefore, the concern of fiscal policy and monetary policy working at cross purposes, that is quite remote to non-existent as far as India is concerned. Now, the monetary policy's inflation targeting framework is up for review and probably by next year. I still believe that, even though I have expressed my views in the past and in the economic survey, sometimes what happens is even if a status quo is not 100% optimal, sometimes changing it could be more suboptimal than letting it continue in the same manner. Because people are used to a particular pattern, and as long as in the operational details, if the policy makers are creative and flexible enough, the framework need not be a millstone round their neck. Yes. I think that is the best we can hope for, rather than looking to disrupt the framework itself, which is relatively young in its life. Yes. So that is what I expect to see happen.
I know this is not your remit, but there is this growing view in the commentariat which says that probably some of the freedoms that the RBI enjoys in liquidity management may in effect negate the monetary policy intentions.
That is,
the question is, can the monetary policy framework, purely theoretical, not necessarily in the India context, should it keep under its purview the liquidity management intentions of a central bank?
No, I think this is a challenge that central bankers have had, regardless of whether they have had an inflation target or not. Between exchange rate, inflation, and liquidity and credit growth objectives, etc., it is always there is always a trade-off. And all central banks, whether developed or developing, and whether they had an inflation target or not, these trade-offs will be always there. And ultimately, depending on the context, one has to let go of some and prioritize some. And I don't think this per se warrants a relook at the monetary policy framework.
Okay. Fair enough. As your presentation, there was one thing that I realized when I think back. You did not mention one country even once, which is China. And yet, it was your economic survey 2 years ago that talked about nuanced relationship with China vis-a-vis investment from there. How do you think in the current shifting geopolitical situations, the government should be negotiating with China, particularly on economic policy areas?
I think the presence of China as a manufacturing colossus in the world is a challenge that all countries face. Now, not just India, of course, the problem is acute for developing countries because to that extent, it prevents the rise of manufacturing in other countries, job creation, capital formation, everything is affected. And we know that looking at the data, India's import of goods from China, they could be made by a foreign company or a Chinese company. That is important to make the distinction. Consists predominantly of intermediate and capital goods, and also some chemicals, etc. So I think these are important components. So our first step can be to plug ourselves into global value chains and continue to replicate the success we had with Apple in other areas, which are intermediate goods and capital goods, etc. And that will not only give us domestic resilience, it will also plug ourselves into global value chain. And from there, then we can look at what is the kind of reciprocity, what is the kind of relationship we should have with the Chinese companies themselves. So this can be done in stages rather than in a one-shot policy move.
That's the interesting strategy.